Hey everyone, it's the Koopa Man. I get into arguments from time to time on a certain topic that is not always agreed upon, so today we're going to talk about it. The topic in question? It's a topic that's so controversial it creates utter divides in entire groups of its adherents. What is and is not canon? Okay, maybe I should be more specific. The canon I'm talking about isn't the biblical canon of what is and is not considered to be part of the Bible, and thus the infallible word of God transcribed by man. That argument comes down to whose church has direct ties to Jesus Christ himself, and the answer is pretty simple when you observe that Constantinople didn't exist during the time of the Gospels. No, what I mean is what is considered the true vision of a creator of a work in works that have multiple adaptations and storylines and whatnot, such as manga being adapted into anime, in which case the anime will always add things called filler, which I'll let Gintama explain.
連載中の漫画にアニメが追いついてしまった時、漫画とのリーチを保つため、別ルートを通って遠回りし、再び合流するという作戦だ。だがこれには様々なリスクが伴う。せっかく迂回ルートを通ったのに、遠く離れたところで力尽きて打ち切られたり、合流した矢先に原作が終了してしまったり、合流するのが早すぎて、すぐまた別のルートに行かなくてはならなくなったり、あるいは迂回している間に漫画とアニメの設定やキャラが離れていってしまい、永遠に合流できなくなってしまったりすることがある。その時は開き直って原作の頭から再アニメ化したり、キャラクターシステムと称してキャラだけ使って作り始めたりすればいいわけだ。
It should be noted that there are some anime where the anime came first and thus are considered the more true canon. Examples being most of the Mobile Suit Gundam franchise, Gundam Unicorn being one of those rare exceptions, Blood Plus, Fooly Cooly, Girls in Panzer, Hellgirl, which has nothing to do with Hellboy, Neon Genesis Evangelion, most of the mecha genre actually, most of the Pretty Cure franchise, and most famously, Cowboy Bebop. For almost all other anime, it doesn't matter if you prefer what the anime did better or if you're more attached to that medium over the manga. Odds are, the original author worked primarily on the manga, while the anime was an adaptation they had far less control over and was simply a licensed work. Therefore, it should be stated that the manga always takes precedence over the anime in determining what is and is not considered canon. Sorry, Ninja Ostrich fans. There are, however, some special cases within the medium. Take, for example, the case of Dragon Ball Super. When Toriyama, may he rest in peace, was pitched to write a sequel to Dragon Ball, he let Toei do it instead, and they made Dragon Ball GT with very little input from him, which, while it did have some good moments, was largely a piece of shit that he wanted nothing to do with. The now completed Dragon Ball Daima being proof of this. Then came the movie Dragon Ball Evolution, which claimed to have Toriyama's direct input in its making, but when the NDA expired, he came out and said, "I had nothing to do with this train wreck." Very familiar. And at that time, there wasn't much of an ongoing culture war that'd make one side or the other brainlessly defend it because team sports, politics, and grifter bucks.
Boo! You stink!
This led to Toriyama writing not one, but two Dragon Ball movies, Battle of Gods and Resurrection F. And after that, he wrote a storyline for both Toei to make as an anime, as well as someone he selected for their style, Toyotaro, to write for the manga. However, it should be noted, both the anime and manga, after adapting the two movies into their lore, were using the same guideline. However, Toriyama is a mangaka first, so he gave Toyotaro more direct input for what his vision for Super was supposed to be. Because of this, it can be stated that the Dragon Ball Super manga is more faithful to the Word of God vision of Akira Toriyama, therefore it can be treated as a true canon.
But Koopa Man,
I hear you crying.
If that's the case, then why do all the games and merchandise use the stuff from the anime and treat that as the main canon?
Well, the answer is simple. Those games and toys and cards and stuff are merchandise for the anime, not the manga. Toei is the one who licenses them out, and Toei is the one who produces the anime, not the manga. Therefore, Toei's work is treated as canon, and this is why you see Dragon Ball GT used a lot in the video games as well, even though Toriyama had very little to do with it. It really is common sense that canon is almost always dictated by word of God, so whatever the creator had more input in tends to be more canon. This is why we see Shy Guys and Birdos in the Mario franchise to this day, while Bowser's idiot brother was forgotten about. Speaking of video games though, in a previous video we went over endings, happy endings, and the fact that some games have multiple endings, with the best ending not always necessarily being the one that's canon. Let's touch up a little upon the canon of games with multiple endings. First off, we have morality endings, in which games with morality systems have different endings depending on the choices made in the game. That said, it's almost always the case that the morally good choices are the ones that are considered canon by the time the sequel rolls around. For example, Knights of the Old Republic 2 goes off the light side ending of its predecessor, Infamous 2 goes off the hero ending of 1, and The Force Unleashed going off the ending where Galen Marek sacrificed himself, rather than the ending where Darth Vader is just fucking dead. Yeah, sometimes it's a little obvious even before the sequel gets made, to be fair. Then we have fighting games where every character's arcade mode has an ending, but unless there is a story mode, only one of them is canon. In the case of Street Fighter, it's almost always the series' main character, Ryu, whose ending is canon, which is a little disappointing because he's also the most boring character, to be honest. Tekken is far better in its narrative of the Mishima bloodline feud. In the first game, the star, Kazuya, defeats his father Heihachi, only to become an even worse man than Heihachi ever was. In the sequel, Heihachi returns from near death to defeat Kazuya. Then in the third game, set years later, it's revealed that Kazuya had a son named Jin with Jun Kazama. After Jun is killed by Ogre, Jin trains with Heihachi to defeat the creature, only to be betrayed by Heihachi afterwards. It's a full-on soap opera, really, except instead of doctors, it's martial artists with really thick eyebrows. Then you have King of Fighters, where every team's ending has somewhat canon storyline elements, but the canonical winner is usually the hero's team of the given game, except for 10, 11, and 13. And don't get me started on BlazBlue, where everything, even the stuff that contradicts the other stuff, is canon. Coming off of video games, however, it's usually the case that major franchises, such as Star Wars, get supplemental materials that are not created by the original creator. For example, the 2 Star Wars video games I talked about, neither of which were directed or developed by George Lucas, obviously, though he was a consultant on both. Though, with Knights, he took a hands-off approach and allowed BioWare to do what they thought was best. While with The Force Unleashed, he had helped develop the storyline, allegedly, which would make it closer to canon than KOTOR. At least it would have been the case before the Disney buyout, but more on that in a second. Star Wars had an interesting tier system for its canon before the Disney buyout, in which various works were tiered. You had G tier, G meaning George, which had the 6 movies, which was the top tier true canon. Then you had T tier, T for television, which contained the 2 Clone Wars animated series, though anything the series did that contradicted the movies was meant to be treated as non-canon. Then there was C tier, or continuity tier, which had most stories set outside of the events depicted in the movies, and then S tier, which was secondary tier, which had any material that didn't fit anywhere above. Finally, there was non-canon tier for things like the Crying Mountain and White Suit Darth Vader. Most franchises like Star Wars, with lots of tie-in material, have tier systems just like this to handle their canon. It's typical for multimedia franchises where the creator usually sells the Word of God rights off or makes a company around them, like George Lucas or J.K. Rowling did. Comic book companies too have tiered canon, though they usually use the excuse of multiverse to get away with alternate storylines. DC calls them Elseworlds, and that's usually the term I use to describe any comic event that isn't canon to the main universe storyline. Examples include live-action film adaptations like the Spider-Man movies, or video game adaptations like Injustice and its sequel, the Batman Arkham trilogy, or Hulk Ultimate Destruction. Speaking of comic books, however, another thing about canon is the creator can go back and decide something that was once canon no longer is, otherwise known as retroactive continuity, or retcons for short. This happens a lot in comic books as they tend to have stories that run for a very long time. One of the earliest examples I can think of is when the Superman radio serials gave Superman the power of flight. The writers at the time thought it was a brilliant idea, so they made it that Superman could always fly into comics, rendering scenes where it said that he couldn't non-canon. Other examples include the existence of the 3 Jokers, the lore of the Green Lantern Corps and the very existence of the emotional spectrum, the lore and origins of the symbiotes, the true identity of the villain Hobgoblin, and so on and so forth. While there's much more to be said about retcons, let's get back to the question at hand. What is canon? Well, canon in its etymology means rule or decree, as it is the church's decree that what is and is not canon to the Bible, which is what is and is not the undisputed word of God as interpreted by man. The authority of the church should not be questioned, as it can trace its lineage back to Jesus Christ, whom said unto Simon Peter, the first Archbishop of Rome and the first Pope of the Catholic Church,
"Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven.
Anyone who takes that into question is taking into question Christ himself. However, that didn't stop the Protestant Reformation, the way that the ending of My Hero Academia implies that Izuku Midoriya and Ochaku Uraraka hooked together didn't stop retarded shippers from creating conspiracy theories and calling the creator and anyone who disagreed with them stupid. Yeah, I'm comparing the Protestant Reformation to stupid shippers, and you can't stop me. But back on point, because canon is about determining what the word of the creator, in the biblical context here, the word of God is, then whomever determines canon must either be the creator or someone who has a direct link to the creator or authority assigned to them by the creator. Sort of like the Catholic Church. Okay, that's enough jabs at the Protestants, I swear. Anyway, this would mean that the author of a work should be considered the be-all and end-all when it comes to their story and lore. After all, it's their creation. This is the case for better or worse sometimes, as the creator will contradict themselves or make decisions that don't make any sense. I mentioned George Lucas and J.K. Rowling for this reason, because they're both sort of infamous for this. Though sometimes stories will continue on without the creator's direct input and still be considered canon, either from the death of the author, pun very much intended, or because the author had sold the rights to determine their canon off to another company, like when George Lucas sold the rights to Star Wars to Disney. While we can agree or disagree about whether or not this is a case of things being better or worse, fans have disagreements over the Clone Wars cartoon being canon over the Clone Wars multimedia project, the canonicity of the inferior sequels over the old legend stories, or the quality of the story in the Dragon Ball Super anime rather than the manga. This isn't an argument of canon. It's an argument for storytelling quality, which is a completely different conversation. But as for canon itself, let's make things simple and make our own little tier list like Star Wars did, using tropes from TV tropes. At the very top, we have the Word of God, the original creator of a work. They always have the final say in regards to what is and is not canon. After them is anyone they may have leased the rights to their works for. For example, Warner Brothers owns the rights to Harry Potter and can create works within the Harry Potter universe that may or may not have J.K. Rowling's full input on. However, if J.K. Rowling herself came out and said a particular work is non-canon to the story, then it becomes non-canon, end of discussion. This is what's called on TV tropes as the word of St. Paul, in reference to Paul the Apostle, one of Jesus' first missionaries. Why they don't call it the word of St. Peter is beyond me, but regardless. Then we have what's known as the word of Dante, in reference to Dante Alighieri, the Italian poet who wrote the Divine Comedy. This refers to works that are adapting a work in question, say an anime adaptation of a manga or a movie adaptation of a book. Dragon Ball's various anime adaptations and the Lord of the Rings Peter Jackson movies come to mind immediately. And finally, there's the obvious non-canon Elseworlds, stuff like Lord of the Rings Shadow of Mordor or Dragon Ball Super Heroes or Superman Red Sun. A lot of these market themselves as separate canons anyway, so it's no big deal. Everything below that is pure fan fiction and whatnot. It should also be noted that if something in a work in the later parts contradicts something that came earlier in the work, the later work is always considered to be 9 times out of 10 what is canon. Islam actually has a principle about this in their belief system called abrogation. It's what makes the more abhorrent verses in their scriptures more canon than the earlier, less abhorrent ones. But it's also a good rule of thumb when it comes to canon works in the fictional media. Using this as a guideline, you won't have any issues understanding what is and is not canon in any work of fiction or media. At least I hope so. But let's face it, this won't be the be-all and end-all, even within my own friend group. But regardless, what do you think? Let me know in the comments, as they help me build a viewing in the algorithm. If you like this video, leave a like and subscribe, as it helps me with the algorithm. And until next time, game on.